Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much all for joining us today. My name is Nathan. I'm a solution architect at Sicilian, and I'm pleased to be joined by Peter, system engineer from Cisco. Today, we've got a really exciting topic, which is all around how we drive innovation and build intelligent networks. And I think I want to just dwell on that very quickly and get to the point on what we mean by innovation. Now, for myself personally, and we consider our traditional network infrastructures that are built in very similar architectures for the last few years, which is you'll have a core switch, access switches, perhaps a distribution layer depending on the size. But largely speaking, we build the same infrastructure over and over again within different organizations. And the outcome is always driven on we need to move some zero and ones around. Now, for innovation going forward, I believe the interpretation of that is that we need to drive networks that are adaptable, agile, able to drive that customer success beyond just the initial focus on moving that traffic around. I'm passing that question directly to yourself there, Pete. What's your views on what is creating an intelligent and innovation within the network?
Well, firstly, Nathan, thank you for having me this morning. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you. I think really this question comes down to innovation, right? Like you mentioned, there are certain expectations people have from a network. I think those expectations tend to be fairly standard across the vast majority of businesses and organizations. But sometimes we can do more with a network besides just wireless and wired access and these kinds of things, right? It's much more than just connecting people to applications. There are a million different directions I think we can go with a conversation like this, right? But I think sometimes it's helpful to think about these things in some kind of framework, some kind of model. And one that often is quite pertinent for us is to talk about it in terms of three W's. So three words, each of them beginning with a W, those being workforce. So quite simply, the users, that could be employees, it could be guests, customers, whatever, right? It's people. I mentioned about applications. Well, we often describe those as workload, right? It's the tools, it's the resources that my workforce is trying to access. But there is another one in there, right? It's workplace. And I think the reason that we like putting that one in there is because in reality, this is the kind of disruption that a lot of businesses have experienced in the last few years. Obviously, we had the COVID pandemic, and I'm sure we'll come back to that shortly. But it's helpful, I think, to think of things in these terms. We often speak in networks as connecting stuff together. Sometimes that's people to people. Sometimes it's people to tools. Sometimes it's people to an environment, a physical location, all sorts of stuff, right? But I wanted to kind of tee up this conversation around three W's, right? Because I think it's quite a helpful mechanism for breaking down what we are actually trying to do with a network.
No, I absolutely agree with that because fundamentally the network is the enabler for a business. Ultimately it's what enables those applications and users to connect. It enables those tools to be used so the business can operate fundamentally. And with that in mind, I think turning that on a much more focused outcome conversation is important. And you mentioned, and it's a very easy example when we think of those three W's, but when we do think of workplace as a very easy illustration of potential outcome change, is ultimately the COVID pandemic, as you alluded to, is a lot of infrastructure was built around being in a set location. Sure, there was a little bit of remote access VPN to extent, aka the ability to connect users into that, but it wasn't designed or built around that. And it changed that focus and shift of IT teams fundamentally. It's gone from being a focus on we've got to keep the lights on, we're building infrastructure to be reliable, to actually almost business transformation. Because at that point, the outcomes you're driving are very different. You need that adaptability so that the business can survive and fundamentally the infrastructure can drive those results. And I think that's very much the same with workload, right? I mean, from probably from all organizations' perspectives, the applications are moving. And I suppose with that in mind, the network's driving force has to be changing towards that. And I suppose spinning that a little bit towards yourself, that be from a kind of outcome perspective, focusing more on those three W's and that change. Is there any kind of key outcomes from your perspective that you typically see that drives, adjustment or reason for reinventing the networking approach?
Look, I think there are some kind of tacit, maybe unspoken outcomes that are fairly standard across any network. It sounds almost trite to mention, but connectivity is kind of the number one, right? Normally, I'm using a network because I have things that I need to connect to each other, right? In its most simplest form. Increasingly, we're getting clients say, well, look, security is actually one of those core outcomes for me. It's not a nice to have, it's an essential part of the solution that I want. And there's loads of other ones, right? I think one that I often like to mention when we talk about critical outcomes is a positive user experience, regardless of whatever it is. If you don't enjoy using it, if you find yourself pulling your hair out trying to use a certain tool, it might not be the right fit for you. So I think some of these are kind of foundational, right? And I'm sure, Nathan, in your own experience of speaking with clients, you hear things like sustainability come up as, this is actually foundational to what we're trying to do. I think with COVID, there was an interesting challenge in there, right? And I wanted to pick up on a word you mentioned, which was adaptability. Because I think what COVID realized is that sometimes with the best will in the world, things don't always go to plan, right? And what happened to a lot of businesses and organizations is COVID introduced a change in the foundations upon which their outcomes are built. And what I mean by that is if you come back to this 3Ws model, what really we're talking about with COVID is that workplace element changed, and it changed without anybody's input, right? It was totally out of all our control. And so all of a sudden, those basic outcomes around connectivity, around security, around good experience, well, there are additional considerations there, right? Because my workplace is not in the office, right? It's all over the place. It's not just homes, it could be coffee shops or wherever. So suddenly that conversation around connectivity becomes more complex, right? It's maybe how do I integrate home users with my SD-WAN fabric, right? Or from a security perspective, how do I provide the same level of protection to somebody sitting in a coffee shop working on a laptop as I do when they come into the office, where maybe I've made a huge investment in firewalls and IPS and so on. So I think adaptability is kind of a key one, right? And maybe this is something that you've seen, Nathan, in terms of clients saying, look, that's a key component for us, because that agility that we can deliver with things like software-defined fabrics really allows us to roll with the punches a little bit. And if any of those things change outside of our control, for example, like people having to work from home, or it could be a change to the Ws, right? It could be a change in workforce or workload or anything else. How do I deal with that? And actually, agility is key, because if you don't know what's coming around the corner, being able to make changes quickly is going to help you deal with that faster.
No, absolutely. And fundamentally, with that in mind, is building the infrastructures now from a requirements perspective initially, right? From that initial offset on what is it outcomes that we're trying to drive. And obviously, as you alluded to, that there's a range there that just go out saying almost, yes, the network needs to get us A to B. Yes, we want to get to A to B in a very secure manner. We want the users to be able to easily interact and be able to control that. But there's other elements of that, which is absolutely around that ability to adapt, ability to drive the fact that we'll have a network that can be innovate based on outcomes that they may not always control. And you mentioned a few platforms there and a few technology sets. I think it provides a nice segue naturally into ways that businesses can build out more dynamic environments beyond that kind of traditional static infrastructure with the use of automation. And I think automation's a very key topic, because there's there's a few interpretations that could be taken on what automation is and what it means from a networking infrastructure perspective, right? And I think just to dwell on that point very quickly on what is automation, right? I think at the highest possible level, we're all aware that it is to typically drive a quicker adoption to change. It is there to reduce manpower, aka you can do the same tasks as you used to without as many people potentially, or less than not as many people, but be able to re-energize the time into other activities, right? And with that in mind, you've got the extreme of almost infrastructure as code, and then you have kind of middle grounds, and then you have the very bare minimum, which could be as simple as an engineer on their own accord going off and say playing around with Python, Ansible, or choose your language of your preference to make a change that they typically do manually in a more automated manner. And I suppose spinning it back to yourself there from automation perspective, Pete, what's kind of your views and what you've seen occurring in the wider community?
Well, I don't think it's any secret that Cisco is kind of all in on programmability, and we do like to use that word programmability, right? Because it's kind of one step above automation in the sense that what we're talking about is the ability to interface with bits of software, right? That could be a management node for a network solution, as an example. It's the ability to get data out and squeeze data in, right? In its most simplest. I'd like to break it down in terms of automation and integration as two kind of very similar and related but different things. And the value in automation is more or less the same that it's always been, right? It's what are tasks that I want to do regularly as an individual or organization wide? Is there something that can be repeated and abstracted, excuse me, so that some software can perform that task? Really, it's an exercise in time saving most of the time with automation, right? And that's immensely valuable. Integration, I think, is a slightly different view of a very similar thing. So I think usually when we speak about integration, we're speaking about exactly what I just mentioned, pulling data out of one place, putting it somewhere else. That can be bidirectional, it could be one directional. Often people will think about seam integrations and things like that, right? But it's really about context and building a bigger picture. There might be automated actions that happen as a result of that, i.e. I've observed some poor network conditions, so I'm going to make a policy change that might mitigate those, right? But from a security perspective, as another example, it could be about providing additional context between my security solutions that is going to ultimately deliver a better experience, a better level of threat protection. So it's about building a bigger picture, right? And I think the reason why both those things are important, automation and integration, is because this is kind of like a hot glue gun, right, for sticking whatever solution you have into your organization. We were speaking earlier about agility, right, and leveraging network agility to deliver real business outcomes. A massive part of that is software, right? Because it's about adding on bits and pieces, bells and whistles onto what you have to make it do more for you, right? And a lot of the time that's about enabling kind of clever use cases that we might not think about typically when we think about a basic network, but is absolutely stuff that we can do with network infrastructure.
I think that's a really good point, actually, because at the base level, what we're really getting to with that point is the network is the enabler for the business, but being able to build upon what you already have, right? We're not necessarily saying here that it's a case you need to rip out your whole infrastructure tomorrow and start again. No, it's actually the network is there already. It is the enabler towards some of these actions that drive better outcomes fundamentally. And I think picking up on that integration point in particular is a really, really important one, because what can fundamentally end up happening in some instances is you end up with a network infrastructure that's been designed to a set standard, say 2 years ago, a year ago, as you initially built out your requirements, and then some change may have occurred, and we'll use that kind of remote working scenario, for example. And then you might need to find ways to integrate the security tools you have from a network security, network foundational level perspective into how that integrates with your remote workers, and whether that be that you start exploring those kind of SASE style solutions, or you are on an SD-WAN journey. Ultimately, it's ensuring those components and your foundational campus and infrastructure networks have integration and can drive very similar results. So when you do explore automation or overall outcomes, they combine and ensure ultimately, as you alluded to, that best user experience.
Yeah, I think it's critical, right? A lot of this is about user experience. And a good example I always like to point out when we speak about automation and user experience is things like chat bots, right? And I use these personally all the time. I think there has been a big surge in interest in conversational bots as a result of things like ChatGPT, right? But actually, there's a lot you can get done with very simple chat bots. And I think the reason that people like them is because it's conversational, it's a dialogue, it's a more natural way of interacting with something than, to take the extreme opposite, command line, right?
Yep.
So we have a ton of clients out there who are doing things like, I want to get a message when there's an issue with the network. And actually, maybe I want to be able to query things back to the network, right? And I want to do that in a chat interface because that's natural for me and it helps fit into the workflow that I have, right? So I think, to your point earlier about, you can do a lot with just a Python script. You don't have to go full infrastructure as code.
Absolutely.
I think that's really true. I think chatbots is a good way of getting started with things like that. But we try to put a lot of information out there. If you go to developer.cisco.com, we have all sorts of guides and sandboxes and things like that. But one of the most interesting things, in my opinion, is we have a lot of repositories out there. So open source code or bits developed by Cisco ecosystem partners, things like that, that you can get up and running with some of this stuff quite quickly. The chances are, if there is an additional outcome, an extra use case you want to get out of some Cisco solution through software, the chances are somebody's done that already, and that code's out there and available for you to pick up and use.
I think that's actually a really important point, because in the same perspective, when I'm talking to my customers, and ultimately we're working on this from Sicilian to ultimately the businesses that want to understand how we go down this route, it's very much a conversation. Again, what's the outcome we try to drive here? And very much from automation perspective, you'll get varied matureness depending on the organization, right? Let's be fairly abundantly clear on it. These are network engineers typically, and then asking someone that's mastered CLI, they've got their CCIE, they've gone all in on that kind of network perspective. They really understand those zeros and ones, and then asking them to start scripting is a very different mindset. And yes, there's ways to adapt to it, but what it's all about is focusing on, well, actually, what benefit can be driven from that. You have the infrastructure that can achieve it, but how can you best interact with that? And in many cases, you nailed it. It's almost the network becomes its own software platform, and you don't necessarily have to sit there and reinvent the wheel. You don't have to spend multiple weekends working out why your Python script's not working, or why that one command didn't go through on 3 of the switches. No, in fact, a lot of this is available off the shelf through some of the platforms that Cisco provide and that Sicilian can help enable, but also from a flip side of that, through the DevNet community fundamentally, right? And I think the clear message here is that actually what we need to focus on first is not just blindly making the decision to go, I'm going to automate my network tomorrow, because that may go really well. It could also end in disaster, because actually we're not focusing on what we're really trying to get to there. And actually what we're trying to do is focus on how can we provide a tangible benefit to the wider business quickly, so that then you can either focus on something else, or actually you've driven a new outcome by the use of these tools and platforms. And I think just on the platform point, because I think it kind of closely aligns, is actually considering what happens day 2, right? You've now successfully deployed a network that drives a very key outcome, strong experience, high levels of security. You've got basic changes automated, so you don't have to be logging into CLI anymore, or you're deploying a new switch and actually you don't have to pre-stage. You don't have to worry about the software that you plug it in, off it goes on the right firmware, standard config, it works, right? That's the premise of where it can really go with automation from that perspective. But day two, it's now in use, and unfortunately, issues do prop up in IT. I think it's abundantly clear that the best designs in the world, unfortunately, will still end up with a whether it's a user issue or actual network outage. They exist. That's a fundamental part of IT. And traditionally speaking, when we think of day two support, the typical approach was some form of monitoring platform, whether that be a single server, a cluster somewhere, whether it's sat in your offices, whether it's sat in your data center. All we really did was a bit of SMP, some syslogs, and someone would log into it on occasion when typically a reported issue, or maybe it alerted via email to you to say, by the way, you've got AP down and your users complaining in London are offline. It's very much kind of that looking backwards opposed to that looking forwards approach. And I think where I'm getting at with this is that assurance play, that more than monitoring. And I think it's a funny quote from Tyson Fury there, but everyone has a plan, right, until they get punched in the face. And even with the world best laid out network designs, BCP plans, DR needing to be invoked and so forth, is actually we need more from the monitoring and that insurance play. And spinning that directly to yourself there, Pete, what is your view on what is that assurance within a network infrastructure?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure if Mike Tyson was talking about networks with that quote, but we can pretend that he was, right? I think you're absolutely right. Assurance is such a core part of everything we do, and all the platforms that we have. In its most simplest form, I think that the key is kind of in the word assurance, right? It's kind of an arm around you saying, if something does go wrong, we can pick up on that and let you know really quickly, right? In its most basic level, it's giving you a bit of peace of mind. I think there's a question in terms of what is the additional value of a kind of mature assurance solution on top of collecting logs with SNMP and stuff like that. And I think there's a few good answers to that question, right? I think number one is a lot of people get a noise challenge. Right, there are so many telemetry sources out there. There are so many different tools that you may have that you are getting a million alerts all the time, right? And there is a real bit of work actually in how do I prioritize that? How do I grade things in terms of severity, in terms of risk, and maybe most critically in terms of cost and how much money I'm losing by having that issue present. And so I think a kind of natural evolution of that is can we apply some intelligence to that information? And really that is powered by machine learning, right? The vast majority of the time we're applying some machine learning model to all that data that we have to help prioritize and really help you interpret what's happening, right? We don't want to just tell you, oh, this interface went down. It needs to be more interpretable by a human, because ultimately it's a human that is going to enact the change that fixes the problem. So I think we can get clever with assurance, right? And it's not just about the assurance that is kind of baked in. If we're talking about something like Catalyst Center, obviously there's powerful assurance features in there, but we can get clever about it. And things like Thousand Eyes have become really successful for us, right?
Yep.
So Thousand Eyes allows you to test performance with software as a service applications, or really any kind of path visibility and things like that you might want to run in tests. That's been really successful for us, right? Because if you're using software as a service applications, or you want to test the availability of your own resource that you're hosting, anything like that, right, can be a very valuable tool. And it's actually something that we can bake into the network, really in a very embedded manner. So we have this application hosting capability on some of the Catalyst switches. You can deploy the Thousand Eyes agent in a container. Bang, you get a network monitoring tool on that switch, right? And we see a lot of clients use things like packet capture tools and that kind of stuff as well on that container platform. Why not, right? You can deploy those through Catalyst Center. You can scale it out really quickly. It's a relatively low touch way of getting a hell of a lot of visibility that can actually be really critical to changing your response to issues from reactive to proactive. So can I predict when there's going to be a problem before it even happens? And then can I do even one better than that and take evasive action before the problem even arises, right? And that's really the ideal goal. And it might be things like, I'm having issues with this one particular application or this one particular cloud resource. Maybe I want to route things a little bit differently, right? Something like that.
Yep. I think that there's a few key points you touched on there. And just to pick up on them now, I think certainly from that assurance perspective, it is absolutely that using the tools in a different way. Okay, the tools are there. You're monitoring fundamentally the network, but as you alluded to, that kind of machine learning, it is taking that different outcome and driving intelligence with the feeds that you're getting. So actually the decisions your teams are making is quicker. So ultimately the user experience is better, but also you can almost then start pre-predicting, if you're starting to see changes occurring in the network or alerts around a certain wireless experience, and the tools are coming back going, by the way, the wireless is seeing some RF interference here, commonly at 12 o'clock, and it turns out there's a microwave next to the AP. You can almost start correlating that to drive more sensible outcomes, which is again all around driving the data in a much better way, because the tools are talking to us in a more naturally understood way than seeing an alert on a controller pushed off to a centralized server, right? So, and likewise with Thousand Eyes, I think again that's a very sensible tool, because with the push towards cloud-based applications, you don't own that full path anymore. Where once you might be able to say, my users connected to my data center, my server, I own every link on the way, or at least I know which carriers have those links, or if you were using dark fiber, there's a certain level of SLAs around it. But when it all of a sudden goes into that big scary internet, as it were, and no one really have full visibility, having tools that can run the tests, as you alluded to, from your network infrastructure, aka you can run these from cloud, you can run them directly on a switch based in your office, so you get really reliable data based on the actual paths it is taking, and that enables again sensible decisions that can be made to drive quicker adaptability to issues. And on that container play, just real quickly, it is actually, I think that's a big one, because it goes well above and beyond just the conversation using, say, Thousand Eyes in a container on a switch, right? That would again make a lot of sense from a visibility perspective. But I think there's a whole different perspective that can be viewed there on what else you could do with that. Again, your switch is there, it can host this functionality, and I've certainly seen a few interesting use cases. But to spin it to yourself there, Pete, you mentioned Wireshark being run on switches. Is there other kind of use cases or kind of awareness what our audience could make use of from a container perspective on a switch?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So it really is just a pocket of compute that is generally fairly close to the user edge, right? Because it's sitting on a switch. So the opportunities with something like that are pretty endless. But I think some of the most interesting use cases have come out of industry-specific examples, right? So one I always like to point out is when we have clients for whom IoT is a major part of their infrastructure, right? Maybe they've got a lot of IoT devices. It's very common in manufacturing and healthcare and those kinds of industries. There's a lot of stuff that we can do with that container platform that supports an IoT environment. So that might be something like you can just deploy an MQTT broker like Mosquito, right, directly to the switch. You could deploy a containerized ASA firewall, right, that allows you to do some kind of macro segmentation. So there's loads and loads and loads of stuff you could do, right? I think the key thing to take away with that container platform is, like I say, it's a pocket of compute, firstly, right? So rather than running that on some cloud resource that's going to cost you money or putting on a server somewhere, you've just got this extra sort of mini server available to you. But the key thing about that is it's very, very close to the user edge. right? So wherever you need compute as close to the user as you can, that's a good way to get the ball rolling in terms of what can I do with this. But I think the key thing is, the answer is anything you want, right? It's just a little bit of compute there. As long as you can get something into a Docker container, you can push it onto that container platform.
Absolutely. And again, it goes back to our opening points, which is it's about creating that agility for your infrastructure and for your teams, so that you can help drive those outcomes more. Because again, in scenarios there with say IoT, it might be when you initially deployed your network, there was no intention for IoT, right? And then all of a sudden a scenario has been sprung upon you. Maybe also need footfall data, or you need to connect a third-party system that wasn't anticipated but has come from a natural evolution. Your network then is able to be adaptable without maybe re-architecting the whole scenario. And you use the example of containerized firewall, and I think that's a great one, because if you weren't doing any kind of segmentation techniques initially, and you had a very trusted infrastructure, or let's hypothetically say you pushed it all upstream to your firewall, and then also you need a high quick traffic flow between users and this IoT system, you might not want it going all the way upstream there. And there's ways, again, where we're just providing those options because the network's already there, and enabling it to adapt in a very quick way to drive outcome. And again, it is all on those outcomes, which is what we focus on for ultimately all our users there. We want to understand those business objectives to drive that innovation of thinking, and looking at new ways to approach it, instead of just going lob that over in a cloud, or you need to redesign your whole network tomorrow. Sorry, it is creating ways that makes it adaptable. And it does heavily link in terms of what we're discussing here, but really these are plays of innovation that can be adapted very quickly. And Thousand Eyes we've already called out, because I think it's very common that we're seeing that new way of working where it is hybrid cloud. There's infrastructure on-prem, there's infrastructure in the clouds, and obviously Thousand Eyes we've called out. But I think there's other innovations that are really worth calling out that are available just directly within your infrastructure. And one, we're at Sicilian at the moment, just going through Office refresh ourselves. And certainly when we were looking at that, some of the plays that we've explored is the use of things like cameras, sensors that are available within the APs, as well as independent sensors, right? And it's ways they can integrate into the network and then effectively provide new insights and data that can drive better results. Using the sensors on APs, for example, environmental status, humidity. And we've got a couple of slides that kind of show some of the platforms here in the background of what you can kind of get from them. And one of the plays that I really like, and I wrote a blog post about this recently, but I think that sustainability element, and kind of passing it to yourself, Pete, because I know Cisco have spent a lot of time and effort ensuring sustainability is a core focus, not just from a manufacturing perspective, but very much from a software perspective.
Yeah, totally. I can't stress enough that sustainability is really one of our key priorities. The reality is the world that we live in and the technology that we have to use to enable some of these outcomes does consume a lot of power. So really, we're kind of obligated to put our thinking caps on about how can we be more intelligent about power consumption and about carbon emissions and these kinds of things. That's not a nice to have for us, right? That's a really core part of all our solutions and will be going forward. So some of the examples you can see on the screen here. So Catalyst Center, there is a dashboard within Catalyst Center for monitoring PoE usage. It's one of those really easy things that is a tool out of the box that you can use, right? And the other one that you'll see on there is the carbon emissions insights from WebEx Control Hub. It's just about giving you these tools out of the box, because, okay, sure, you could do this all before with APIs anyway, but it's such an essential, such a widespread outcome that people want from our technology that it needs to be baked into the solution, right? So that's what you can see here. I think you were mentioning as well about some what we have kind of baked into devices and this idea of future proofing. Again, there's all sorts of crazy outcomes that you can do with this. I think some that I would always want to point out is when we start talking about wireless and we start talking about cameras and these kinds of things, then we can get really crazy about the outcomes that we want to deliver. And I think it's helpful to break it down by industry again. So retail is a really good one, right? If you have, say, Meraki cameras in a physical store, we can do all sorts of clever metrics around measuring dwell time, right? And how long are people spending in different parts of the store that is helping inform decisions about how that store should be mapped out, right? What is a typical user journey, a customer journey through that store,
Yep.
right? And ultimately it's helping you drive sales. Another one that I always like to point out, and actually came out from a hackathon project. We supported a hackathon, and one of the projects was using Meraki cameras to detect, the idea is it would be in homes for the elderly, and it would detect if somebody had fallen over and could send a message to one of the staff who could then go and see if they were okay and take whatever action was necessary. You don't have to have cameras to do crazy interesting stuff like that. And if you're interested, what I would recommend is Googling the Cisco Pen 1 office in the US. And that's kind of our flagship office for smart buildings and what we can do in the office environment. And what you'll see there is when you book a meeting room, you can see, is it stuffy? Is it hot and kind of sweaty? Have there been a lot of people in that room? What's the temperature? What's the air quality like? And then based on that information, we can interact with HVAC, for example. So, I want to open a window or chuck the aircon on. There's loads of stuff you can do, right? Or museums, right? If this, certain artifact or whatever is getting too much heat, that it might, affect it in some way, maybe mess with paint or something, then we can detect that. It really is, like you said, Nathan, earlier, it's about business outcomes. Start with why am I doing this? What's important for my business? And then we can break it down into the technology later, because we always like this phrase, the art of the possible. But I think when we start talking about automation and we start talking about assurance and all these other things we can do, it really is about how we can leverage the network to deliver that art of the possible.
Absolutely. And again, it goes back to the point of the network is an enabler. And on a few of the plays you mentioned there, some of them really generally excite me, and they're conversations we're actively having with our customers on ways to actually drive these new outcomes from the existing networks they have in place. And you mentioned the Pen 1 New York office, and it is worth calling out a part of our Sicilian office refresh. That's absolutely elements that we're going to have in play, so we can drive and show that innovation from a hands-on perspective within our customer experience center. Something that we're very much excited to get customers in with once that completes. I think, just glancing at the time now, I think it's an important topic for us to address now is we've demonstrated and spoken of quite a few different ways to drive new outcomes. We've mentioned some of the nice plays of automation and assurance, but really, how do people start on this journey? How do we get there? And certainly what Sicilian does, and I certainly have a lot of conversation with my customers with, is focusing on that low hanging fruit. But from your perspective, Pete, how do we kind of start moving customers towards this more intelligent networking decisions?
I think it's a really good question, Nathan. And I think there is probably no real answer. I think all of it will end to speak to us, right? We know what we see customers do. We see what the trends are in certain industries. And often kind of copying other people's homework is a good way to get started, right? If you're kind of having a look online or wandering about even, and you encounter kind of interesting use cases that are being enabled by technology, then there's no reason that we can't try and replicate that. But it's a question about kind of divergent thinking and really putting our thinking caps on and a bit wonky and back to front, right? You've got to get clever about this stuff. There is a model that I'm sure many of you will have seen by Simon Sinek, which is called the Golden Circle, right? And it's 3 concentric circles. I think we've got a slide just showing it. So the idea is, you can see in the middle why, right? Why is at the core of everything that we should be doing. In this context, what we're talking about is the key business drivers. right? So forget about technology for a second. What is important to me as a business? That could be things like revenue. It could be things like sustainability. It could be, it's really the top line items that, putting the network to one side, right? It's what am I trying to do overall as an organization? We can break that down then into use cases, right? So once we know what are the key things that are important to the business, we can then start thinking about, okay, well, what are some kind of tangible, feasible actions that I could take to enable that? And then we look at, okay, out of those outcomes, how do we kind of line that up with technology? So you see an example here, right? We've spoken a lot about sustainability this morning, Nathan. Sustainability is a key outcome for a lot of businesses. So many businesses have made, net zero pledges by certain dates and so on. So when we break that down, it's really actions that we can do, right? To either improve energy usage or reduce carbon emissions. That's kind of the obvious stuff. So maybe one example you mentioned earlier about shutting down devices, right? It's kind of again, low-hanging fruit there. That's how, it's maybe one of many hows in terms of how we're going to enable that top why. But then we look at each of those hows and we can say, well, actually, that's something that we can do with our technology. So in this case, we can use Catalyst Center to power down devices on a schedule. But this is just one example, right?
Absolutely.
Those whys, that's the bit to nail, right? For your business, you can break that down into the hows, and then we can help figure out how to map the hows to the whats, right?
Absolutely. And this is quite a key point because it is driving new ways of thinking for our technology teams, fundamentally moving away from that traditional mindset of technology, or wow, this one's got a lot of high throughput, or this CPU sounds great, to actually thinking instead of what can we do from a business transformational perspective. And that's something that I spend a lot of time actively with clients really discussing. It is, what are the whys? Because once, as you alluded to, we understand the whys, yes, we can still build a network that achieves reliability, that has security, that has fast connectivity, but we can add in those extra elements that really drives innovation and intelligent network decisions, right? So it is that change of mindset. And ultimately, what I would encourage anyone in attendance today to do is really spark up a conversation with myself, and let us spend the time with you and your teams, understand the whys, how we can help transform the networks that you already have in your offices and drive those new outcomes with hopefully very little work associated, aka making just use of those tools that are already there.
I totally agree. It's ultimately, a dialogue is very helpful for this kind of stuff, right? And often getting into whiteboarding and things like that, it is a good exercise for coaxing some of these ideas out. So do work with us on it. But I would say, as a starter for 10, if you Google Cisco Portfolio Explorer, Portfolio Explorer is just a tool out there on the Cisco website, and we've broken down by industry some key use cases, and you'll see loads of key use cases on there. You can look into how we're actually enabling that, what components are involved. You can find case studies, all sorts. So really, if there's an extra call to action I can add from a Cisco perspective, it's check out that Portfolio Explorer, because I think I mentioned earlier about kind of copying the trends and seeing, that the organizations out there who are really on the bleeding edge of this stuff, what are they doing? You can get a good idea of that by looking at the Portfolio Explorer.
Perfect. Thank you very much, everyone, for your time today. We really appreciate it. And again, if we can help any further, please do reach out, and we'll be more than willing to spend some time with you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Nathan.